snatch maximum, clean and jerk maximum, 4 hours later and do the same thing again. There was a point where we'd squat, 18 times a week, and then it got even more ridiculous.
That's Max Ada. He's the founder of Weightlifting AI and Coach Logic, and he spent over 2 decades in the sport of weightlifting. First as an athlete under legendary coaches like Ivan Abadjiev and Boris Shaiko. Then later as the only coach of 5 separate senior American record holders. In this episode, we discuss the mistakes that weightlifters make in their programming and technique.
I did an enormous amount of training, and a lot of it was unproductive. You can miss a lift for one of any 3 reasons. The reason for that problem happening can be really varied. For beginners, it's almost always that they just catch the bar really high.
Some of his more controversial opinions in weightlifting.
You're at a peak in competition. You should be in the worst shape of your life, but you should be extremely good at a maximum snatch or clean and jerk. I don't think the interference effect is really that significant.
And the biggest mistakes coaches make when tracking data for their athletes.
There's this idea that data is going to give us all these incredible answers that no one knew before. The problem with a lot of this data tracking and doing too much of it, they found really simple data points, which is volume and intensity.
Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Last Set Best Set podcast. I'm Coach Brian. I'm the owner of Big Ben Strength, and I've been teaching Olympic lifting for the last 11 years now.
And I am Coach Calvin. I'm current captain of Lindenwood University's Olympic weightlifting team, as well as a coach through Big Ben Strength.
And today we have a special guest with us, Max Ada. Max, you want to intro yourself a little bit?
Yeah, I'm Max Ada. I've been coaching weightlifting and powerlifting for probably the better part of about 20-ish years or so, 15 years, and yeah, I've been involved in a bunch of different big things and some small things, and yeah, overall pretty good. I've got a gym in Oakland, California as well.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody who's in the area, go check that out. All right, so the thing that I wanted to start off with is talking about some Bulgarian weightlifting. For people who don't know, you actually were able to train under Ivan Abadjiev, who is the creator of the Bulgarian weightlifting method. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what the Bulgarian method is?
Yeah, well, so I trained with him when he was in California. So he was here. He was in the U.S. when I trained with him. We lived with him. The Bulgarian system is back in the 60s, back in the 50s, 60s, people were training, kind of a few times a week and starting this whole process of learning about, sports science. And Abadjiev basically kind of came along and started pushing people harder and doing more training. And as this evolved, it turned into something where, he, in his words, he described it as he'd watched gymnasts, practice their sport all day. And he figured, why can't we just do that with weightlifting? And so he just kind of kept evolving this, I think it was a Soviet program at the time he was using, into this thing of we'll just start going heavier more. We'll start doing more of everything. And, on top of this, as time went on, he just kind of cut out more and more general training and general exercises until he basically had a system of training that was, basically only really heavy maximum weights, basically every single day, multiple times a day, and, without really much attention paid to other qualities or individualizing the training a ton. So most people were doing the same thing. There wasn't a lot of accessory volume or pulling or, general training going on. That didn't mean it didn't happen, but there just wasn't a lot of it planned. And his whole philosophy really was, why would we do all this stuff if it has, it doesn't have a direct transfer to your results. And so, yeah, he was wildly successful for an era. In the 80s and the 70s, 80s, 90s, they were really good. And then, they had different top stars emerge through that point in time, through, each one of these generations that kind of rekindled the sport in Bulgaria every so many years. And yeah, so it kind of became romanticized as this elusive, extremely hard training that worked super well, but you'd have to survive to do it.
So people are going to maximum on snatch and clean and jerk and front squat multiple times a day. What was the top end extent of that you saw? What's the craziest version of that you saw?
It just depends. So there's kind of a few things you have to remember with it. There's what it was intended to be, so what he would put people through, what people actually did, and then what stories they told people. And I think there's a lot of discrepancy in those 3 things. So, when I did it, my coach when I was growing up, Steve Goff, he was a huge fan of this idea of just like pushing super hard. You know, he was a Marine. He was like this just, hard charging kind of coach. And so we would do like, our workouts turned into front squat first to maximum, like your first movement of the day, then snatch maximum, clean and jerk maximum, front squat again, then come back in the afternoon, 4 hours later and do the same thing again. And that would be like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday would be the same, but maybe we do like power snatch or power clean in the mornings, or max powers in the evening. But like, yeah, so there was a point where we'd squat, 18 times a week, and then it got even more ridiculous where you'd squat in between the snatch and clean and jerk too, and you just take like a max front squat. So that kind of stuff was common. Then you'd start to get people that would train, you'd miss, and you start missing, and let's say you're at a max weight and you miss it, 7, 8 times. Sometimes you miss 20, 30 times. The first time I clean and jerked 160, I missed it 29 times and then made it on the 30th. It's like, it was just like craziness of like, just try and never give up, just never give up. So there's a lot of that involved in it. At the level I saw the Bulgarians, and you see like you didn't see quite that much recklessness, but there was a lot of people just like, I watched Nikolai Super that was there at the time try to clean jerk 230 like 7 times, and he cleaned every one of them. He just missed the jerk, 7 times out front, and it's like that was sort of the norm. And I'm sure there was even more crazy instances. I heard stories from a friend of mine, John Bros, who was also really big into it, and he lived with a guy named Antonio Krastev, who, up until the last 10 years had the heaviest snatch of all time, and he told him a story about his legs being weak, so he just squatted triples at 250 until he got to 50. So he did like 50 triples in one day at 250 kilos. So like there was stories like this, and you have to remember like one. Crazy numbers, crazy stuff, super hard training. There was obviously a lot of drugs involved in Bulgaria, and at the same time, they were all basically, they didn't have to go make money anywhere. So they lived there, they trained in these camps. So there was a lot of this, like, just ability to do that. I don't think it's anything particularly special about them or the system. I think there's a lot of young men that could do these kind of things and just push themselves crazy, super, super hard. They're tough people all over the world. But it was definitely like unique because it was like at the same time it was also wildly successful. There was a lot of phenomenal lifters that came out of that era. Some of the best performances of all time.
And I think that there's an element too of that where it almost like lines up with what a young male lifter kind of wants to do. Which is like they want to go, like anybody who's coached male lifters, it's like almost exclusively just kind of holding them back a lot, and trying to get them not to do that kind of thing. It almost like lined up with the psychological aspect that a lot of weightlifters want to pursue. But then you also mentioned that this kind of was like there was a lot of drugs that were involved, a lot of PEDs that were involved in being able to do this. So we actually had somebody ask, Caleb, who asks, what PEDs were they taking? Like, what was making all this possible?
So the stories I was told was when they first got Dianabol, I think it's methandrostenolone from the West, like when they first started manufacturing this, they would take, the story was told to me by Abadjiev, straight from his mouth, was everyone in the gym, this is like probably really, really early, would take like one pill, like 1 5-milligram pill the days they trained right before they trained. And nobody was really getting that much better. Like they were getting stronger, but no one was like really, and then one guy was like, I'm going to just take like 10 of these every day and see what happens. And he did. He just started taking a bunch of them, and then suddenly his numbers just went like crazy. And he went way up high, and like they were like, "Oh shit! Well, we're all gonna do that now." And so they all just started taking more and more and more. And I think they would all take like different versions of testosterone. I'm sure back then there was very limited amount, but I'm sure it was all just whatever testosterone cypionate or some kind of like suspension or something, and then they would basically just take these, Dianabol and testosterone and whatever other drugs that existed. For a long time, I know in Germany, like turinabol and Winstrol became very popular, and turinabol was kind of this drug that was sort of like undetectable, and it was difficult to catch people with, so it became very popular. But a lot of this was like the drugs they used, and this is true probably even to today. It's all just a matter of like what they would do is the drug testers would get equipment, they would figure out how to track and how to catch somebody. Then the countries would just buy the same equipment, the same lab, maybe even use the same lab like we saw in Russia, use the lab and be like, okay, well, how do we pass the test? So it's just this game of like, oh, they figured out how to catch it. Okay, well, now we need to figure out how to pass it. And it's just a matter of different games you play, right? Different processes, whatever. Nothing is particularly that sophisticated. It's just a matter of like, how do we do this? The drugs they would take would, vary from whatever bodybuilding drugs existed at the time to, to whatever they couldn't take as time went on. So it just evolved with that. I mean, you'd talk to them about it and they would give you a straight answer like, oh, we did this and this, but like it was really insignificant. It wasn't like they thought of it as like they didn't care about it. It's just like you take drugs and they work. They didn't think of it as like what I'm sure like a lot of like hobbyists that are into like steroids, like, romanticize each drug and its magical effects and these things. They just were like, okay, give me the blue pills. I'll take those.
Max, is this all being told to you kind of like by Abadjiev about what they used to do, or were there a certain amount of Bulgarian athletes training in California as well? Because from what I understood, Abadjiev basically tried to apply Bulgarian weightlifting within America, and that was kind of his thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would sit down and just talk to him, just ask him. They weren't like, none of these guys would like not tell you anything. You just ask, hey, what did you guys do? What did this? I would mostly ask questions that were like, what did this guy lift in training? And just run down these lists of people. I wanted to know, like, what were the numbers? How much did they do in training? What was the biggest thing you ever saw? These things. But there was 2 lifters and then Abadjiev that lived in the house with us.
A quick interruption to the video to tell you about something we've been working on for a long time, the 10-week squat program. One of the reasons I've been able to make progress in my Olympic lifts so quickly is through my strength reserve. As an 88 kilo lifter, I've back squatted 230 kilos or over 500 pounds. While we don't compete in the squat, having an excess of squat strength allows me to get in more training in the Olympic lifts as they don't fatigue me as much. And of course, if you can't squat a weight, you're never gonna be able to clean it. So if you feel like the squat is what's holding you back, be sure to use code LASTSETPOD, all uppercase, at checkout to get a 20% discount on your program today.
I've heard some crazy stories involving a goat and some toilet supplements. What are some of the crazy things that you experienced there?
So none of that happened. There was no goat, but the story was told to me that he wanted to have a bunch of goats, and he was like, we'll starve the goats, and then right before they die, we'll slaughter them, and then put their blood in a centrifuge, and then inject the plasma into the lifters, and that will be like, some secret, formula that makes you strong. I think Abadjiev had a really poor knowledge of science, to be totally honest. Like, I don't think he was really, he didn't have this like mastermind of like, okay, like we know exactly how genes work, all this stuff. Like it was not sophisticated. He was a phenomenal, he was a very passionate weightlifting coach, and he drove people extremely hard, and he constructed a phenomenal environment and strategy. But I don't think it was like, oh, he had some deep knowledge of that. And then the other thing was he made some kind of alcohol one time for us. He fermented it in the back of the toilet or something. Not in the toilet, but it was in a bottle, I think. And it was disgusting. It was awful. We were all joking that we were going to go blind after we had a shot of it.
That's insane. So, I'm kind of curious to know, we kind of talked a little bit at the beginning about how the Bulgarian method kind of came about. a lot of these lifters were doing very Soviet style programming, and then they wanted to try and refine this down into what was really just maximizing the specificity aspect of programming as much as they possibly could. Can you break down, especially because you've been putting out some really great YouTube content lately, breaking down some of the different schools of programming and how they came about? Can you break down some of these different schools of programming as it relates to like Russian versus China versus Bulgarian approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the easiest way to look at this is that you have to first understand the fundamental, like, what are the first principles of training, right? Like, what are the principles that exist that, you know, exist whether we want them to or not, right? So like overload is a principle, specificity is a principle. It's like this principle of specificity just tells us like how closely an exercise or really a stimulus is to the actual performance that you're trying to make it improve. And it's essentially just saying like, you know, we can use specificity as a yardstick for identifying a movement or a training method or whatever it is and say, does this have a high transfer to the actual thing I'm doing? And then across that spectrum, you're going to have different exercises. So example would be like a power snatch is a very high transfer to a snatch, right? Where like, you know, the long jump has maybe no transfer, or it's like, you know, the correlation's extremely weak. So that's a principle. And then the same as like overload, like we know that training must be sufficiently hard enough or stimulative enough to drive adaptation. And so we can look at it and say, okay, here's some training, X sets, reps, intensities, speeds, whatever, applied to an athlete. You know, what is the outcome of that? Do they get better as a result? Do those, you know, qualitative aspects of that adaptation improve? And then we can say, okay, there's some degree of overload there. So knowing what these scientific principles are, we can then look at every single system and just basically look at every system as a manifestation of the implementing of these principles. So we say the Russian system is just a way of, you know, systematizing how we apply these principles or how we augment or, you know, implement these principles with an athlete. So the example would be like the Russian school of thought would be like, we construct phases of training that have, you know, distinct, you know, goals within the boundaries of that phase. Then because of that, we filter down the exercises that fit best in that phase. You know, so our specificity might be very low in one phase, meaning that the exercises don't have to have a strong direct correlation to the movement, to the sport of weightlifting, but they could be general in nature and they augment some of the basic qualities, or they might have a transfer to a certain quality that is beneficial but not directly related, maybe like hypertrophy, right? So then that whole Soviet school of thought is to say, let's construct training, you know, that builds upon itself, that has a phasic structure that we can periodize, and then we can organize our training such that we can manage when fatigue is happening. We can manage when the athlete's going to be in the best state that they're going to be in and when they're not going to be in that state. And then that gives us more predictability as to what the competition is going to be like when we actually get there. And then they just continually refine how that process is laid out. The Chinese system is the same. You know, basically every system that's modern uses some methodology that evolves from that. Even the Bulgarian system, you know, is an application of the principles of training, right? If you know, the principles of training are specificity, overload, fatigue management, stimulus recovery adaptation, variation, phase potentiation, and individual differences, right? And so you can look at it and say, how do these principles, how are they manifested in the Bulgarian system? Well, they took specificity and overload, which are the most important, and they said, okay, let's just optimize for them. And then fatigue management, well, hopefully that happens, you know? And then the rest of it is all kind of like a moot point to them. Where you look at other systems, it might be that there's a significant amount of effort designed into the system to maximize or optimize for every principle along the way in every step. So when you're designing a program, you might take each one of these principles into account as you write the training program, as you design it. So I think that sort of gives a better perspective on what a system is. Every system's the same. It's all going into a gym and doing exercises to improve your some quality that either directly translates to being a better weightlifter or indirectly translates to that. It's just a matter of how they structure it, what they organize, how they put the pieces together to get there.
Yeah, so I wanna ask real quick too, because a lot of times when you think about these systems, you got to kind of put them into the, I guess, the cultural context of the
Yep.
area where they're from. Like I think a good example in today's weightlifting is like North Korea. Like we see these athletes training insanely hard in the training hall going into a world level meet. Um, but we have to put that in context of, I mean, what we kind of know and half don't know about what's going on inside North Korea. How much of that relates back to, do you think, like with Bulgarian weightlifting, like kind of social and cultural situations inside of Bulgaria? Because I have essentially very little knowledge on, kind of what Bulgaria is like. It's been described as maybe like a country full of gangsters or something like that, is what I've heard. But what do you have to say about that, you think?
I mean, so I'd look at it like uh, you have principles, you have like the governing dynamics of what has to happen, right? Then you have a system, which is essentially the strategy of how you're going to apply those. And then you have the third element, which is the actual execution of that strategy. And that's what I think largely these cultural differences, have the biggest impact on is in in the United States, you're not going to get execution of a system or a strategy that revolves around living in a gym 8 hours a day and not talking to your family for 3 months. Like that's just culturally too difficult to execute. No one's going to want to do it. I mean, and that could be true almost anywhere. No one's going to want to do it. No one's going to participate. So adherence to that strategy is going to be low, which makes that strategy less effective. You know, translate that to North Korea, and I have no idea, but I have a feeling they're not super open about their athletes being on, TikTok all day, and if they even have phones, phones that don't just have the North Korean operating system on them, where you're basically in a spot of like the execution of any system would be easier because you have two choices. It's like you do this, or you go back to the farm and you're probably going to starve to death. So it's like, what can you change about the execution of your system? If you can get 100% maximum adherence to the strategy, then you can maybe augment the strategy a bit and make it even more aggressive, right? And you have to think about all of these things as there isn't a good, better, best. It's always trade-offs, right? Having an extremely intense, aggressive system of training that maximum or optimizes for just one or two principles that are most critical. The trade-off is that, yeah, you probably will make a lot of progress, but the trade-off is potential injury and burnout, and that system can fall apart at high levels because it's difficult to sustain all the other variables that come into play, right? Or that, that system doesn't work well for certain people that have, deficiencies or weaknesses that don't get included in the system, right? If leg strength isn't your biggest weakness, then a program that emphasizes leg strength an enormous amount might be a terrible choice for you, right? So it's all trade-offs, but I think the cultural element is just a matter of how well you can apply and execute the system. And in some cases, it's the other way around, right? The cultural elements will dictate what kind of strategy you can actually employ, right? There's no way there's going to be a strategy here in weightlifting in the U.S. where we would allow people to train in a way that they just get destroyed or broken or hurt or end up with brain damage. We do that in American football though, right? So it's like there's just different cultural things there.
Yeah, because I think about it almost like, the Bulgarian system or the Chinese system. They're kind of very locked into whatever their national team coaches decide is best. And so we've seen kind of an uptick in American weightlifting in the last couple of years. I think kind of in part because there's so much experimentation that can go on
Yeah.
different gyms around the country. So people can kind of almost hone into what they think is the best because they're seeing different strategies work. They're not just locked into whatever, the Olympic Training Center decides to tell them is best.
Yeah. I think if you look at a lot of what's going on, it's like the best way to really kind of tune your BS meter is to be like, if somebody can't explain the system in a quantitative way and explain to you why this is done and for what reason it has an impact, then, and it's a lot of like, like airy fairy, like, sort of like just in the wind, like, oh, we do it because it impacts the magical power center inside of your heart. Like it's more indicative of the fact that there's probably less of a system there in place and more of just like a program or a sort of like traditional sense of doing things, right? So like a great example would be, if you couldn't, the Russian system and the Soviet stuff is all very, very easy to digest. The East German stuff is, because it's very quantitative. They can say, we do this. We know that we found that this number of repetitions, this intensity, these exercises had the best result, and we organize them in this way. We can show qualitatively or quantitatively, like, this worked in this way, and we have this theory as to why. If you have a training system where it's like none of that is really easy to explain, and it's just kind of like, we do a lot of things that seem good and they're cool, and this is Chinese because they bend their knees after they do a pull, and that makes you better at this because, whatever things you want to say about it, that may or may not be true, and there's no way to gauge that because it's all qualitative. It's just like, these are the things that make you a good weightlifter, so we do them. You start to become it starts to become harder to parse out what's a good system, what's not. Like, where is training successful and why is it successful? It's the Bulgarian is a great example of this. It's like, if you were to distill it down to the most factual stuff and really look objectively at it, it's like, what were they doing so different? Well, they just optimized for competition. They trained and competed like 15 times a year. They were doing competitions all the time. They were training with really heavy weights all the time. They had a methodology at the time in the era of passing drug tests that allowed them to continue doing that. And so, like, is it a system? Yeah, it's a strategy. Like, don't get caught taking drugs. Use as much as you can. Lift as heavy as possible, and be really, really good at taking attempts that are going to win you competitions. That's a brilliant strategy and system objectively from the 30,000-foot view. But when you try to apply that same method to 9 kids living in the middle of Nebraska and train out of your garage, like, it's probably not going to work so well, right?
And a large part of that is just because at a certain point you need a larger sample size, because it almost kind of seems like Bulgaria's approach was, let's create a system that will develop champions and weed out the weak. And it's like, let's see who can handle this, and those probably will be really good athletes, and the people who can't handle this will just kind of get left
I
on the
would even
wayside a
say
little
when
bit.
you use terms like weed out the weak, it almost romanticizes it. Every system already weeds out the weak. Like, the weak people aren't coming. People that are weak are not already coming to the gym. The people that don't even have any interest in weightlifting have already been weeded out by the fact that weightlifting is something they don't want to do. It's like the natural progression is to say, our goal is identifying individuals that can win the country of Bulgaria medals, right? And if we think that the strategy to get there is to apply a simple, straightforward methodology, or whatever it is, this methodology, we will find people that rise to the top. So our only concern is that. I was told a story by an Olympic champion that when he started training, they put them all into a team, like a small group. They all trained and did this sort of traditional kind of program. The athletes that did well, the top 5 people there or whatever, moved to the next group, and they just kept doing this, group after group after group, right? And ultimately, it was like, at 11 or 12, they started giving them steroids, and they just kept going. And it was like, this is a system. It's like, just find the top performers. That's all we care about. The natural progression is that the weak or the people that are not capable, they're not top performers, will always get weeded out because they just aren't going to rise to the top. So it's that same thing. It's just like every system in the world is like this. School, right? Getting into college, right? It's like they take the people at the top, or getting onto any team, they're going to take the people that are the highest performers, right? They don't take an equal sample size from everybody who applied and then say, okay, we'll hire them all, and then we'll spend all this time and money training all the people that aren't there. It's just, I want the best, bring that guy. And they just come to just put more people through the mix, and you end up with the people at the top.
I would say maybe it's probably safe to say that most people probably shouldn't try and run a Bulgarian approach, or maybe as you mentioned in one of your videos, maybe you do it for a little bit to try and get it out of your system, so you understand why it's maybe not the best situation for you long term. So with that approach and that mindset, what should people largely be focusing on, especially in that beginner to intermediate range?
So when you're new, I think we have to think about it from a couple of perspectives. One is what are the goals we have set out? What are we quantifiably trying to achieve with beginners? And it's a few basic things. It's like, one, we want to teach them the skill. So we want to give them a good understanding of the actual skill itself. So they have to learn the snatch and clean and jerk. Two, we want any strength training we're going to do to be something that would augment the musculature or any kind of areas that wouldn't already be developed by practicing the skill. So things like, shoulders and elbows and low back and things that we know are problematic that could become an issue later on. We want to start to head that off and develop general strength qualities in those areas. And then, the third thing is we want to make training something that's enjoyable, that kind of is a carrot instead of a stick. Get them to participate and learn and practice and enjoy the process. The way I would think that would implement itself would be, one, you have some dedicated practice to the exercises themselves, right? Second is you're doing some kind of general strength training to sort of build those areas up like we talked about. And then finally, to keep training interesting, exciting, you can do a host of different things. You're already going to do some general training anyways because they're young. So you add more exciting general training in. You can add more variety in for the sake of like unlocking new skills by learning how to do hang snatches this week or learning how to do this new movement. And it keeps it exciting and interesting and engaging, but at the same time it's productive, right? Because they get exposed to a variety of different technical elements and skills and constraints that force them to have to reinforce that skill and learn it from different positions or different, with different constraints. And you just kind of progress this over time. And then when you get to a point where that athlete, goes from day one to, whatever, 6 months down the road, and you feel, hey, they've got good mastery of the skill. They understand how to do it fundamentally. They have a good sense of how to train, the hygiene of training and taking care of themselves. And then they've developed some degree of general capacities. You start to, add some loading to the program and start to increase the load and gradually develop their skills at higher intensities and start to ramp that up more. And then as they get beyond those stages and they start to progress to intermediate levels where their technique is relatively stable, they might make, one or two different errors, but that's very consistent. And it's related mostly to their anatomy and their muscular strengths and weaknesses. Then you start to specialize the program and start to incorporate more exercises that are going to remediate those things. So, if your legs are weak, you might start incorporating slightly more leg exercises, right? The goal is not to just simply take somebody who's new and say, we snatch and clean jerk every day until you're really good at it, and because doing snatches makes you good at snatches, and then 6 months down the line or 2 years down the line, they have a terrible lift technique because they got behind the bar super bad on it when they started and no one ever corrected it. Right? And they've never done a pull in their life or never done a hang snatch, so they don't have any ability to stay over the bar. So you have to slowly titrate this in so that you get to a point where the athletes have consistent errors that you can then remediate with the right movements. And then from there, just kind of keep progressing. And the program should always evolve in a way that it's either expanding in variations and volume and intensity, or contracting as they get closer to competitions or they become so skilled that putting more effort into things is a waste of time, right? If you already squat 300 kilos, squatting 5-6 days a week to try to make that 310, when you clean and jerk 170 is probably not worth it, right?
Those sound like some very specific numbers. Is that?
I knew a guy. Yeah.
Just doing some research through this, I saw something that said that You attempted a 320 kilo squat, which I think is like 705 pounds, 18 times in a row.
I made it the 19th on at a competition. So I tried it every single day for a few months leading into this like powerlifting meet I did because I had hurt my hand, so I couldn't do weightlifting anymore. And I missed it on my second attempt, and then I came back on my third, repeated. That was the miss on my second was the 18th miss, and then the third attempt at the meet was my 19th try, and I made it. And it was like, I don't know what I did differently, but I just made some subtle like change and like, okay, I'm gonna like change this tempo, this one little thing to like try and push through this point. And I got through the sticking point. I remember that. I was like, I remember leaving that, and that was, the rest of the meet was terrible. I don't think I lifted well on anything else, but I remember thinking to myself like, there's no way that I can get to 710 pounds. There's no way I can get to the next number doing this same way. The same strategies doesn't work. Like, I'm not going to just miss a million squats in my life and get to these big numbers. And, so I totally changed everything in my philosophy. And I actually worked with a Russian powerlifting coach who changed a lot of how I did things.
And I think that concept of like what got you here won't get you there is something that is really important. I wish more people talked about it. Is that something that you think do you think that you should have tried a different approach earlier? Or do you think that you were successful because of this and not despite it?
It's a good question. If you'd have asked me this right when I hurt myself as an athlete, I'd be like, yeah, I should have done something different because I can win the Olympics. If you ask me this now, I say it wouldn't have mattered because I wasn't going to be that good. And ultimately, I believe that coaches are people that it's a really unique profession, right? It's like a really different kind of thing you do. You kind of have to have the right blend of I don't even know how to describe it. Like really good coaches in my mind, they have a little bit of they're really competitive, right? You've got to have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder to like, you want to beat everybody. You want everyone to win. You want all your people to win. You kind of also want the other team to lose. You kind of have a little like chip on your shoulder about like, you got to do really good and prove it and push people forward. And you have to really want to help people. And like part of that stems from like maybe not having success yourself and being like, man, I know what's right. And I can really like help you fix this thing or improve that. And so I say this because I think I wouldn't change anything I did because it made me a much, much better coach. And if I had trained in a way that worked really, really well for me and been a guy who did, 150, 190, or whatever, 160, 190, like would have been great numbers, but like that wasn't going to be anything, that special in the grand scheme of things. And maybe I would have been way worse than that. Like, I'm probably gassing myself up there. Like I would have done, slightly better than I did. And I would have been like a, 18th place at nationals. And I might have hung on to something like for a long time, trying to be better and better and better. And, it might have just been like a very different story if I had trained differently and been better initially, but never really got that good. Where versus like doing it this way, I learned a ton of things and I had a huge, crazy experience all throughout my lifting. And that was probably more valuable in the end than having been a good lifter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I can pretty closely relate with that as well. We're just like, I'm not a very good lifter and I've probably hurt myself way more than I need to. But my athletes are probably better because of that.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Let's do just something that is maybe a little bit more practical for any of the coaches that are listening, and possibly some athletes who are listening and kind of interested in programming. What are the 3 biggest mistakes that you see new coaches and athletes make in their programming?
I think the biggest thing I think people make in programming overall is like not having a good like overall plan to evaluate that process. So they'll write a program and they'll run it and then kind of like however it works, that's cool, and then they come back to it and just start from scratch again. The second thing I would say is they don't have a good sense of like how to scale the program from one level to the next. So it's like we run a program and then we just run it again and again and again, and that's what we do. And there's no real evolution of the training at all. And then the third is probably like training for the sake of what's enjoyable versus actually doing things that are beneficial, right? And so that's like a lot of like, we all max out on Friday just forever because that's what we do. There's nothing necessarily wrong about that in context, but it's like if you just do the cultural things of like we train, for weightlifting, but then we also do these things that are more just for our own personal enjoyment. You need to reconcile that and say, I do this for fun, therefore I can't be upset when I don't make progress, right? Versus actually saying, hey, the goal is progress. That means that whatever is the least wrong decision to make today, we do that.
And on that first point, especially, I think that that's a really great point. I think a lot of people don't actually do that, which is how do you measure the actual success of the program?
Yeah.
What are the things that you're looking for as far as the success of a program?
I mean, the first thing is before we even start it, like what's the definable, like what are we trying to achieve, right? Like what are we trying to achieve? If we can't measure the outcome, if we can't say, hey, the outcome should be X, Y, Z, then we can't know if we ever got there. So we can't train for things we can't measure. If the goal is way too broad and you're like, the goal is to be a better weightlifter, it's like, well, that's great. Like, what does that mean, right? So you have to have definable characteristics. They can be qualitative. They can be, hey, we want to move better. So you take some video before and you say, what are we doing wrong in our movement now? At the end of this, we want to see these things remediated to some degree. And that might just be a rating. You sit down and say, these snatches look like a 6 out of 10 quality wise for these reasons. You write it down, and then 2 months later, you evaluate again. You're like, hey, those points we talked about before, they look way better now. These look like 8s out of 10s. It's simple as that. And then the second thing would be, actually like looking at the efficiency of your program. It's really common to give a program that's extremely hard. It's a huge step up in volume and intensity and just an overall much, much more aggressive program and be like, see how great my program is? Everybody did it and they all made progress. And it's like, well, yeah, because they all increased their training output by 30%. And it's actually a much less efficient program because you might have people making a small amount of progress doing 3 days a week of training, and then they get thrown into a program that's 5 days and there's 4 really hard squat sessions and their squat goes up 40 kilos. And it's like, great, look at that. Look how good it is. It's like, well, it's just larger. So is it more efficient? Is it doing things in a better way? If not, it's just like easy to throw these huge programming increases at people and have great results, and you do that. So I think that's kind of like important to make sure you look at how efficient is the program. Are we, the number of reps, the intensity, the volumes of the things we're doing, are those just growing exponentially and that's why we're making progress? Or are we actually doing a better job of organizing training and applying it? And then 2, are we actually quantifying what we're trying to achieve with each training phase or each cycle? Like these particular numbers have to go up in these exercises, or this has to be better than it was before.
So, as far as like different phases of training, what would you say? We talk a lot about volume on our podcast. We feel like a lot of lifters miss out on volume. What are
Yeah.
you looking for in a volume phase? What are maybe some like KPI? Like, is it like a 10 rep max, or is it, what are you looking for there?
So I mean, I would look at it as like your goal should be to try to. Everybody has a finite, in my opinion. I could be totally wrong about this, but everybody has a finite capacity for assimilating training, right? People can do a lot of training. I mean, I did an enormous amount of training, and a lot of it was unproductive. But people are going to have a sweet spot of like, let's just call it like an average weekly volume. So total number of reps measured between whatever numbers you want, 60 to 100 or 70 to 100 or whatever, but like a stable number that you can say, hey, this is the average amount of training we do in a week in a volume phase. And we train it at this sort of average intensity. Like the average weight of the barbell of all the barbell movements we do is about this number. And we try to stabilize that. Our goal is to get to a point where that's stable by continually growing the amount of volume we're doing until we see like detrimental performances from that increase. So a good example would be like when I was coaching like Alyssa Ritchie years ago. We would start at say like 200 reps in a week on average, and the goal was like let's continue to increase this over training cycles. And we got to a point where she did 1 week that was like 450 reps in a week, and she actually had pretty poor results from that. And so we started to realize like, okay, like we need to back off. Like the sweet spot for her was somewhere in that 300 to 350 reps in a week, like in that volume phase. That was our goal from the perspective of like, we need to stabilize this number and find that out where this is at. And then as we do more training, we can't just continue to grow this number. So now what we're looking for, like you said, the KPIs, like how can we find ways to organize the training that one, addresses your technical errors, and two, allows us to slowly increase that average weight of the barbell across that phase so that overload, this overload can take place without us having to just, hey, every week add 2 kilos. So maybe that's like a clever sequencing of exercises where maybe we start the cycle with these high rep sets or high rep weeks, but we use constrained exercises where 5 triples of no hook snatch is, it's going to be 5 or 6% or 10% lighter than a regular snatch, or more power snatches or more complexes, things that sort of artificially reduce the average weight, but can still be trained relatively hard. And then as we progress and we sequence through these exercises in the block, we might start to remove those constraints, and that does 2 things. One, it allows us to easily bring back the average weight of the bar and increase it, but at the same time not make any real modifications to the program. It's just making it slightly easier, which allows us to get the program to become slightly harder, and then the average weight of the barbell increases. So the goal is to, like, in a volume phase for me, is find stabilized training volumes and then slowly increase the work capacity by growing the volume week to week. And then as we do that and we find that, hey, volume's getting really high, we might need to reduce these constraints to make it tolerable, where the average weight comes up now because we're not doing the no hook versions. And, we can slowly start to bring those things into play so that when we get to the end of the volume phase, the athlete's able to tolerate, the intensity stuff much better because they have a huge work capacity, but they've also gradually increased the average weight of the bar. And so now doing a bunch of, doubles and triples at 80 and 85% is very doable.
So you're almost saying, because like in my mind, a lot of volume programs, they start with the highest volume on week 1, for instance, kind of like a set, range that coach thinks is, the good amount of volume. And then it basically tapers down throughout the entire program. The volume just comes down as the intensity goes up. But you're saying that maybe a volume phase should almost include a more ramping up of volume to finding that spot where that lifter, maybe even, this is a more individual approach, obviously, but that specific lifter, starts to struggle with the amounts of volumes they're doing. You're seeing their speeds in the squat like really decrease. You're seeing those things that they're a little too overloaded. And then taking that number that now we've reached kind of their capacity and tapering down from there while the average intensity comes up. That's basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like the whole point of like the reason we describe something as a volume phase, this comes back to overload. The principle of overload tells us 2 things: that training has to be more difficult than it was, more stimulative than it was, and through like reason, there must be a mechanism that we are leveraging to make more difficult. And in a volume phase, I think we can all probably guess what the answer to the mechanism of what we're trying to make more difficult, which is volume. So we're playing with the lever, the mechanism of volume in trying to gain the adaptation. In a volume phase, we're not trying to increase the exposure to maximum intensity lifts. We're trying to increase the exposure to volume. And there's multiple reasons for this. One is work capacity. We need to develop some general physical qualities like the ability to tolerate large amounts of training. 2, hypertrophy to some degree. And then 3, the more volume we do, the more repetitions we do, theoretically, the more practice we get. So in that early volume phase, as we increase volume, we should be able to increase the amount of exposure to technical training we can do as we get closer to the actual like intensification period. So in any phase that's volume driven, that the mechanism is volume, we should be looking to maximize those things. And there might be a proportion of each, right? In a person who's really advanced, hypertrophy might not be a super small piece, might be a really big piece. Somebody who's really new, exposure to a bunch of different exercises and a high degree of variation might be really beneficial because they need to learn and assimilate the technique in a lot of different ways.
Quick interruption of the video to tell you about the OlyStrong team. The OlyStrong team is my group coaching program designed to be affordable and effective. You'll get access to your choice of 3 or 5 days a week of proven programming, daily video feedback to improve your technique, and unlimited coach messaging to ask as many questions as you'd like, including the dumb ones. Most coaches charge hundreds per month in coaching fees, but I'm giving it to you guys for less than $30 a month. And you can try it for free for 7 days by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below. All right, back to the video. One thing I'm curious about with the approach to just how general a newer athlete's training might be, you know, you mentioned on a video recently about Ilya Ilin's training as a young athlete, as a youth athlete, was very largely wide base of exercises, lots of different exercises, a lot of that involving like running, jumping, general physical preparedness stuff. Yeah. And then that over years got to be more and more specific over time. With athletes now who are starting in their 20s, starting in their 30s, how important do you think that phase of training is for them where, you know, they may not be in the sport for that period of time? Is that still something that's important, or is that still something that can be, you know, shortened and condensed into periods of time and not necessarily something that is important for a long period of time?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on what the goal is. Like, I mean, if somebody comes into training and they're unhealthy, like they lack a degree of like foundational fitness, like they don't have a high level of mobility, they don't have a good degree of flexibility, or you know, they lack like, you know, enough muscle mass for their height, like then these qualities need to be probably addressed. But again, it's a question of like, you know, you get a guy, I work with a guy who, you know, was like a tech guy, he's really tall. And like, you know, he was like a jujitsu guy and had all this like fitness and stuff. And then, you know, he would come in and say, like, well, you know, I've lost a lot of that fitness because I've spent so much time just doing weightlifting. Where it's like, yeah, that's probably a trade-off you'd make from the sense of like, yeah, you're going to be better at weightlifting. He's much better at weightlifting now. But at the same time, like you lose some of that general fitness quality. So there's a degree of it that's a foundational element. Like you need that to be able to train. But at some point, like we don't need to just like worry about constantly driving general fitness as high as possible, because, you know, it's probably not going to be super beneficial to somebody who's you know, like a masters athlete who's competing to be, you know, at their ninth meet, you know, like that's probably not going to be the thing that drives results. Newer, younger athletes, it should definitely be, you know, a bigger priority. But again, like you said, probably it just depends on each person, but short phases of it. I think there's a benefit to having a lot of periods of time that are removed from doing, you know, intense like snatch, clean and jerk, focusing on this, and like you give yourself a month of like general training to reinvigorate your motivation. You know, people get pushed really hard and you come right back into a training cycle and you're burned out already coming back to heavy snatches or heavy squats or whatever. Whereas if you took a month off from that and focused your training on a lot more, you know, call it athletic sort of general fitness stuff, it might become a really invigorating process where you come back to training and you really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's like right after a competition is like the last thing I want to do is hop into doing sets of 10 on a squat, you know?
Right.
But that's kind of the approach that a lot of people will use.
And, you know, by definition, like when you come back from, like you're at a peak in competition, you should be in the worst shape of your life. Like you should be in that cycle. You should not be good at in long, steady endurance. You should have low work capacity, but you should be extremely good at a maximum snatch or clean and jerk.
Yeah, I'm thinking about during some of our peaks that we do at Lindenwood. I'm like going to class, just huffing and puffing up the stairs. Sitting in class, you know, I'm so fatigued. I'm just like buzzing. Like I just can't even hear. I can't even hear what the professor's saying. Just looking out the window. Oh, it's been 10 minutes. I look back. I'm like, oh boy, like I'm deep fried. Why did I even come to class?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, those times like really get to you when you're really pushing hard into a meet. You're really just like so good at snatch and clean and jerk and nothing else in life at all.
Yeah. You know, and I would say too, like something I would do more now is like, and you see this a lot in powerlifting, it's just like give yourself some small exposure to those skills as well throughout the whole training year. So like some singles, some heavy singles that exist throughout the program year round, not like max out days, nothing like that, but maybe you touch 85, 90% at least once a week as a single, like before some volume work, as a way to kind of reduce the difficulty of getting back into that condition later. So you always stay in touch with these kind of like exposure to, you know, near max weights. And it's like it gives you a bit of that ability to, one, gauge where you're at any one time. If that number is dropping off considerably fast, then maybe you need to, you know, make some adjustments to training. Or if that number is, you know, is climbing up, you might be like, hey, you know, this kind of training volume is really good for me, and it's actually like this is right where I should be right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say even I think with other qualities. So you say that, you know, obviously with snatch or clean and jerk or back squat, you know, hitting some heavier weights year round. But I think even when it comes to some of those more, you know, cardiorespiratory or general fitness qualities, like if you go through a volume phase and you are doing some cardio and you are doing, you know, high rep accessory exercises as well, completely cutting that out for months and months of the year, it's going to take so much longer to get back into that fitness
Yeah.
where the maintenance dose is probably a lot lower than you think it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Like two
I
times a
agree.
week of like 30-minute cardio, like on a bike, like no impact. Like, is this really taken away from your training? Not that much, but it's making sure that you're not like me going up the stairs huffing and
Yeah.
puffing probably every time you go to class.
Yeah. It feels like the general consensus is in the modern state right now, the contemporary training is that a concurrent methodology makes the most sense, and having some qualities being present at all times is going to be like the most extensible system because it's easy to move from phase to phase, right? You can move from whatever quality you need to the other, but without like removing that entirely. And maybe in a really big competition, you might eliminate some of that cardio the last couple weeks just to avoid any excess, fatigue. But like for the most part, like, you know, there's not a huge, I don't think the interference effect is really that significant anywhere.
I've been seeing more and more people talk about how the interference effect might not be as much of an
Yeah.
interference as people think it is.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to experiment around a little bit more with more cardio in my training throughout the year.
It's
Yeah.
it's something that specifically I'm pretty interested in too because I did 4 years of high school cross country
Oh,
immediately
wow.
before getting into weightlifting. Cross country and distance track.
Yeah.
Not exactly the best foundation you could probably think of for going into weightlifting. So I think a lot of that fiber typing is, you know, I was also like, you know, 30 pounds of muscle heavier than everybody else on cross country. So
Nice.
that fiber typing is probably a lot more genetic
Yeah.
than training a lot of the times. So, you know, then I also kind of sucked at cross country too. I was not very good. And I immediately excelled in weightlifting. I'm like, huh, maybe I should have been doing some of this, but I don't think it held me back terribly when it comes to going to weightlifting after that. And if anything, I think it did kind of help. I think about my cross country days competing. I just dreaded competing. It was so painful. It was so, you know, mentally tough to get through a race, to get through a really hard workout. Like weightlifting's a breeze now. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of the nature of. I mean, I think CrossFit over the last 10 years showed us that too. Like, there were people that were. I mean, I worked with a bunch of CrossFit athletes, and they were not in bad shape at all, and they were smashing weightlifters. And it was like there was really a hard argument to make for that. Like, oh, hey, doing some running and being in really good shape is gonna like really cut kilos off your total. And in fact, when they would stop that, they would oftentimes not really do any better, if not sometimes just worse. They just looked like they were less they were less fit athletes.
Anybody who's coached CrossFitters for a little while who like dabble in the weightlifting space will probably very much be nodding their head in agreement, because that is exactly something I found, where I think we're going to start seeing more and more people talk about just work capacity in general as like something that's really helpful to have as a foundation to get into the sport. Because a lot of CrossFitters, I mean, we joked about it in the beginning days of CrossFit, where of course, who can lift that heavy while running constantly and doing all those pull-ups and stuff. Where now they're just like, they can do all that, and that might be why they're able to do so well in weightlifting, as long as they just have the ability to not like get too erratic with their approach to training and whether or not they want to continue lifting.
Yeah, we got two girls at Lindenwood. We have one that was with us last year, Grace, who was like a career gymnast and then CrossFitter. Comes into weightlifting, very, very little weightlifting experience outside of CrossFit at all, basically none, and is smashing, an 100-kilo snatch and 120-kilo clean and jerk, 70s body weight. Like, it's just insane. And we got Ella Nicholson coming onto the team next year.
Yeah.
Another girl, CrossFit. They're very similar, and a lot of the times, kind of how they move, or how they, their training background. They're both gymnasts, both CrossFitters. Like,
yeah. I think that's like the best combo, like a female gymnast who became a CrossFitter. It's like, and then gets into weightlifting without getting too broken. Then you have the perfect foundation for a really good female lifter.
So one thing I wanted to get into a little bit, especially as we're talking about trying to find the appropriate training volume for different athletes. Right now, from the outside looking in, it seems like weightlifting AI is the largest collection of data on weightlifters and weightlifting volume in the world. Would you agree with that?
I don't think it's that big. I'm sure there's probably something. I'm sure China and Russia have done. I know Russia had massive studies and a lot of training data. But yeah, I mean, the goal with a lot of that was to try to collect a lot of information about how different things impact athletes, like what's going on as far as like, when we build a program for somebody and they do this or we add this, like what happens. I would love to have done more with that. I think the next version of what we're doing is way better, and gives us a better way to deal with that and collect more data. Plus, we can incorporate video as well, so we can collect a lot of video data from people over the years with the new platform we're building now.
What are some of the things that you guys are working on with weightlifting AI?
So I started a new company called Coach Logic, which builds like a coaching platform for coaches, and we'll incorporate all like our new methodology of building programs with like AI tools, and so that'll give coaches the ability to basically like create programming really fast and then modify to what they want, right? So we'll build out like, hey, here's what we found works. You guys can obviously build your own thing. As time goes on, we'll build it such that coaches could like talk to us and we could construct some small like version of what they do as a coach. So if you're like, hey, I like to do this, this, and this to fix this problem, we can kind of incorporate that. That's the end goal. But basically what we want to try to do is, one, take a lot of this stuff and build something that we can actually extract data from and say to somebody like, why is this person getting better or worse in this phase? And look at the training and say, well, we think it's this, this, and this is the problem. If we have something that's more like, okay, we've got a huge volume here and no volume there, and this intensity is all over the place, we would be able to extract that and say, hey, this might be the problem. And so the goal is to like try to give more of this high level stuff to coaches so that they can direct something versus sitting in the trenches and writing out more sets and reps for, a bunch of people. When the reality is like, the choice is right, what you want to do, tools should be able to do this thing for you. And then that data will then trickle down into how we learn about what makes athletes better. And then we can hand that to, we can rebuild our models and make our training better as well. So we can have a much better, like, almost like open source version of training where everybody's information can get assimilated. We can learn what actually works better.
I think data in general has become kind of a hot topic in the weightlifting coaching community. Just over the last few years, seeing more people get excited about things like velocity-based training, or even just tracking training volume and intensity, which is a surprisingly hard thing to actually do, especially if you have a pretty big team or something like that. Implementing that, getting even just the intricacies of getting athletes to log things correctly makes this really challenging.
Yeah.
And so it makes it hard to develop practices based around trends that you see in the data. So with what you guys are building, is something that I find really interesting as a potential is the idea that, you guys have so many athletes using the system and logging workouts that we can start to find trends like athletes in X weight class and under tend to respond really well to volume for longer phases of training
Yeah.
than athletes who are in higher weight classes, and things like that. Is that something that you guys are hoping to be able to do?
Yeah. I mean, stuff like that I think would be really beneficial. The other thing is being able to identify your own biases. Like you program these, like these are the exercises you use the most, and how that compares to the broad range of what everyone else does. And you might find, hey, I do a lot of panda pulls. I'm doing lots and lots of panda pulls, but no one else is. You might be like, okay, like maybe I can look at and reflect on like what I do that's different than what the general consensus is. And it might be that it's good or bad, but it's like, I think that kind of thing is helpful because it gives you an understanding of like, what is the stuff that the successful people are doing, athletes that are making the most progress, and how is that different than from what you're doing? You might find that, hey, you're programming lots of high RPE squat sets, and that doesn't seem to be the norm for people. Without having to sort of guess that from the meta of what's out there, you should be able to look at data and give you some information there.
Something that was pretty cool. I don't know if you know this, Max, but for about a little over a month, I stayed with Hampton. I lived with
Oh,
Hampton.
nice.
And I had maybe a lot of questions going in, and I
Yeah.
figured I was gonna kind of get all the answers when I went there. Um, but no, it was quite the opposite. I left with more questions. But
Yeah.
but one of the cool things I got to see is all the tracking that they do.
Yeah.
They probably track more than anybody.
Yeah, they track everything.
And so I see it's probably like a spreadsheet with about 40 tabs on it.
Yep.
And his dad, Trip, his coach, is showing me, this is his life. This is everything he tracks. So he's putting his Whoop data in on there. He's putting all the calories he's eaten on there. And then probably the coolest part was kind of their intensity and volume tracking spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So it somehow auto-populated from his training spreadsheet, which was a different one, but he'd input every weight he did above 60%, and then he would track that average intensity throughout the entire week, and the total volumes lifted. I think like the volume loads as well, and you could see like a trend, and it was like sort of color coded in something as well. And so I'm asking, I'm like, okay, so like how are you using it? Like I'm like ready to get the secret nugget to weightlifting, right? And basically, what Hampton's dad tells me is like, well, when we see him go through a period of higher volume loads with lower average intensities, and then he comes into a period of lower volumes and higher average intensities, that's when he's having his best performance. And I'm just like, I'm like blinking. I'm like, well, I mean, yeah.
It's this is not uncommon. Is that people will. I think there's two things here with tracking and data, and there's one, the excitement of it. It's gonna give me all these answers, and the reality is like, I mean, I know so many coaches. I talked to like Spencer Arnold one time, and I was like, all this velocity data he tracked. And I was like, what do you do with it? He's like, nothing. It was like, and maybe he did later, but he was like, I had nothing right now. And it's like, you have all this, but like, what are you getting that isn't already known from the principles of training?
With Hampton, I think the way they're using it, they kind of have those specific targets that they know are there for Hampton.
Yeah.
They know that average intensity that they want to, the lowest average intensity they ever want to get to, because they know when they drop below that, they see bad training performance. They
Right.
know when they go above this volume, kind of like we talked about tracking
Yeah.
total reps. They know when they get above that total volume, he starts to move real slow. So it's a lot more intuitive. It's like the numbers, they don't have a framework for exactly what
Yeah.
number is best for everybody. It's him specifically, yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably the degree of what we really get from data is to say, here's the range that we are going to be successful in, and it's your job now to find clever ways of arranging training such that you can optimize for that, but also you can develop a better strategy around how can we do more of this, or how can we recover from more of this, right? So like if you know there's boundaries and you found the boundaries, that's like 90% of the battle. The rest of it is all about like how do we develop a training program around this that works for us, you know? And so it's like I think there's this idea that like data is going to give us all these like incredible answers that no one knew before, and like every weightlifter that's ever won a gold medal, I would guarantee probably doesn't have that much of a concern for the data behind it, right? Obviously, there's for sure some, and I think it's much more popular in like powerlifting. But the reality is like that's actually really valuable. Like, hey, we know the boundaries of this. You're never going to get caught. Let's keep adding volume and see what happens, because you know what happens. You've learned this, and you know that hey, the sweet spot is right here. And you might, with more data, get more and more dialed in to say like we know that within like a 3% range, this is where we need to be. We know this is the best training volume that provides the most progress with the least, amount of negative impact, right? The lowest trade-off there. When we increase that volume 10 or 15%, we're still okay, but it just becomes less efficient, so it's not worth doing. And so it's like you're making small adjustments like that. But yeah, it's like there's a lot of stuff with data that it can almost become like data is the end goal versus performance. And so, yeah, it's always hard to tell.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I think about Abadjiev, and I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't seem like he tracked very much at all. Um, and then you compare that to the Russians, right, where it's
Yeah.
all about tracking. Like it's like so much of their system is tracking to see when the best things happen and kind of scientific methoding your way through that. Like it's a true science there.
Yeah.
Then it's almost funny, maybe a little ironic to see like somebody who's just very hard headed like Abadjiev just like will his way,
Yeah.
to the top almost.
I think a lot of it too is very much it's all individual based, right? Like some coaches were super detailed, some were not. Some had very specific training methodology, some didn't. And so like even in Russia, there was coaches that were whatever. Like the Germans were extremely methodical, and like I'm sure the Chinese seem to be as well. But like a lot of it too is like it's always a question of like you can do all this stuff, but are you doing it in a way that's meaningfully helpful to you, right? And like it's easy to be in that spot where it's like Abadjiev just was like we can optimize for execution and these two things, and that's enough, you know. And it worked in an era. It doesn't seem to work now, that exact model, right? Whatever Carlos is doing, that's working for him. But it's like it's a very different kind of like yeah, it's a very different kind of game.
And something cool to me too is thinking about, because you see kind of these tracking models work really well with athletes that are kind of like Hampton, that
Yeah.
they're very capable of tracking all that data and know it's important for them specifically. They know it's their key to getting to that top level. But I mean, if anybody here listening, has ever been a coach, they know, it's.
Yeah.
I think maybe out of like the 8 or 9 athletes that I coach right now, like 2 or 3 of them put in all their weights into this thing. And
Yeah.
so you have to learn how to apply maybe the data you get from the people who do track to the
Yeah.
people who don't. And sometimes that bridging that gap is almost hard. So you have to know what you want to do and how they're responding even without having those direct numbers as well.
Yeah, and it's like a conscientiousness, right? Like, what kind of athlete do you work with, and how well do they work within your system, right? And like you weed, you sort for the person that is going to work well in your system. They will rise to the top, and more people like that will come in. I have a lot of athletes like that where you have a female athlete I work with who logs everything because the output is better when she does, because she makes more progress when she's put her numbers in, and I can make adjustments in a finite level with her program. Whereas there's other athletes that they don't, and they don't see that result because there's no data to draw any changes from. And then you end up in a spot where it's like, well, they just like, well, does it matter? It's like, well, it would if you put it in, but you're not. So like you end up in this cycle of like trying to just argue with people about doing that.
Yeah, I think that there's like this element of a relationship with a coach and an athlete that People who track and people who do everything will get better results over time, typically. And then athletes who don't do that thing will complain about the results that they got off the work that they kind of didn't do, you know?
Yeah.
And then with data in particular, I hear people say this kind of a lot in different aspects, but data is really only important if you're going to change something off of it. You know, so like if you're tracking all this stuff and you're just not going to do anything with it, you probably could save your time not tracking that kind of stuff unless you're going to do something with it.
Yeah.
And maybe that time would be better spent like developing a better coach-athlete relationship with people, you know, refining your coaching ability, refining your cues, like just developing the actual skill of coaching rather than tracking all this stuff that is useful if it's applied. But if you're not going to do anything, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's like one of the biggest. Again, it comes down to like, you know, when we built Coach Logic, like we put 3 different metrics into track, and we'll add more as we go. But like the goal is like you don't want to overwhelm people with this idea of like all these numbers are important, right? This is something you learn also when you deal with a lot of like these like language models. Is, you know, like language models work off of probability, and if you think about it from when you have conversation with somebody. If you were to give a prompt to like a chat GPT and in the prompt you threw a word in there 100 times or a bunch of different things, or you like you were describing like, you know, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and in the instructions you kept using the word critical, this step is critical, this step is critical, it can get confused as to like, well, what's actually critical? Because everything is critical, then maybe nothing is, and then maybe just this first thing is important. And so like you could end up with a really bad output. And so it's the same with people where it's like if you constantly put in front of people that everything is the most important thing, they will lose focus on what that is. Like what is most important, right? If I was showing you a bunch of data with a training program and being like, this volume, this is the most important data point we track. Oh, and this is also the most important. And this is important too. And that's important. You would be like, well, what is? It's either all important or it's not. And if everything's the same level, then nothing is actually more important than anything else. So the problem with a lot of this data tracking and doing too much of it is you end up in a place where you might lose you sort of lose the trees from the forest, right? Like you're trying to find valuable KPIs, but you've also tracked every single data point you can. And now you're like muddying the water with like, well, what's really mattering? Like what really matters? And Hampton's a great example. They found really simple data points, which is volume and intensity, right? And maybe the amount of salt he eats in a day isn't important. It doesn't mean it's not worth tracking, but it's like that doesn't have the same importance as the amount of volume and intensity he's doing in any one week or in one phase, right? And so it's the key is in distilling down what's worth focusing on and what's not, so you don't get lost in a sea of like all this different stuff. You know?
So with tracking, and if people are going to start trying to track some sort of data in their programming, I kind of think of it almost like how we recommend with nutrition. Like you probably don't need to track your nutrition 24/7, but maybe doing an audit on your training or on your nutrition, right? Track what you're currently doing without changing anything and see what you find. And maybe go from there. And that might be a good way to help you find those limits that we were talking about rather than, and it may be inaccurate, maybe slightly inaccurate. Maybe it's got a 10% range of variability that's a little bit different on either end of that. But people who are tracking really closely, like Hampton, maybe they've only got a 1% or a 2% variability there. But just a little bit of that could be helpful for you to help kind of figure out what are the actual important metrics and then what your boundaries are, you know?
Yeah, 100%. I would say too, like keep it simple, right? Track things you can actually modify.
Let's go ahead and dive in a little bit into some technique stuff. I think that this could be helpful for a lot of the coaches and athletes here, especially you wrote a book a while back, The Technique Triad, which when I read it, it kind of broke my brain a little bit in the simplification of things. But I was also at that time weirdly fascinated with trying to rank exercises in their carryover to the lifts, and this actually was like such a simple way to do that, and I really appreciated it. So can you break down what the technique triad is?
Yeah, it was like, this idea that like, lifts there's like a few major components to exercise, to snatch and clean and jerk, right? That are actually like everything stems from these potential problems, right? One is basically like you can miss a lift for one of any three reasons fundamentally, right? Which is like the bar height, you don't pull the bar high enough or don't move the bar high enough. The trajectory of the barbell, it's not moving into the right place at the end of its path, or the time you take to move into the fixation point is too slow, right? And so breaking it down like that, you look at it as like, okay, if movements are failed because of one of these three problems, the reason for that problem happening can be really varied. Like your technique can be poor, and the manifestation of that is that your bar trajectory is terrible, or you might not pull the bar high enough, in which case your power output's not there. You need to move faster and be stronger. So rather than say every exercise has a problem that fundamentally is like there's a fix for it in another exercise, you should look at it more from the perspective like what's really the broader picture here, which is like, are my problems mostly in that I don't control the path of the bar well, and that's a manifestation of having poor technical control of certain phases? Is my problem that I don't move under the bar with good enough speed, and that's a problem of I'm not fast, or I'm doing something incorrectly that slows me down and I can't transition under the bar quickly? Or, do I actually lack power and I need to become stronger or more explosive to make more lifts? And so, that was kind of the initial reasoning for Reddit. And then what we do is kind of take exercises and say, if you have this issue, then these are the exercises that are generally going to be considered the best practice for remediating that. I've kind of done what you said. Like, I've always tried to do this thing of like, I want to take all these exercises and learn what would be the best way to use them, or what issues would be best served by this. And a lot of times people want an answer, which is, if I have this problem, do this exercise. And it isn't necessarily that simple. Because like, really what we want to say is, I have this error. My error stems from not controlling the bar path correctly. Then you can say, okay, that narrows down the list of movements to this category. And now you have a list of like maybe 20 things or 10 things versus a list of, 100 things. And then you take that 10 and you can dial down what particular part of the exercise am I doing poorly that I could correct with these exercises.
So can you give us a few examples of maybe some exercises for each of these three elements in that technique triad? So for bar height.
Yeah, so like, something like bar height, you need to develop more power. So like you would start with like these would be exercises that are going to develop general qualities. So like squatting, pulling, power exercises, something that you can increase, strength, speed with, and power output, and just actually get the bar to move to a higher point, which really is like a proxy for being able to lift a heavier weight to the same height, right? We don't want to necessarily try to catch weights higher. We just want to get more powerful with some weights. So if you lack strength in those areas, especially low back and legs, then, you need to do something for developing that. And there's a whole spectrum of things. You'd start with general strength, hypertrophy, squatting, pulling, and then move to power variations, and then translate that into faster speeds on the bar. Trajectory exercises are all going to be stuff that puts more constraints on the movement, that you're forced to execute the lift with a more similar or more constrained technique. So like anything from pauses where you have to stop in the middle of the pull, and that constrains your ability to be wrong. No hook, no feet exercises that constrain your ability to have a loopy bar path. Those really work well for that kind of thing. And then, time to fixation, which is not just speed into the bar, but it's the transition from pulling on the bar to moving under the bar. So you could start early with things like snatch balances to develop confidence if you don't have that moving under the bar, and then translate that into things like, high hang, high block exercises where you have very little time to accelerate the bar. So the emphasis has to be on moving under the bar immediately after pulling, and moving under the bar rapidly, so you develop more speed there.
That's so interesting, and it's like the thing that my like brand new coach brain absolutely latched onto.
Yeah.
Was like I can go in and like categorize different exercises based on the different elements of their technique, but then it gets down into that point where maybe a newer coach is going to do the same thing and be like, okay, it's this exercise will solve this problem.
Yeah.
But you still, at the end of the day, have to make sure that the athlete is doing that exercise correctly. That's a problem that I see athletes make with variations a lot, where they'll use the variation supposedly as a tool to improve their full lift, but then they'll end up optimizing for the variation rather than its carryover to the lift. So a really common example of that is block snatches or block cleans, where athletes will immediately after breaking that bar off the blocks, they'll start whipping their head back and throwing back. Right. Another example that maybe is like a snatch or a clean from the hip, where they'll just get an excessively deeper and deeper dip, or even more of a forward torso angle, and kind of swing the bar. And so they're optimizing for the exercise, the variation, rather than its carryover.
Yeah, well, that's where I'd say like things like complexes make sense, because what you do with those exercises is emphasize the technical skill you're trying to exaggerate, and then have the most proximity to the actual exercise you're trying to transfer it to. So like for me, complexes always just fall into like one of two categories. It's either done for some kind of capacity improvement, like a front squat or a clean front squat jerk, or it's done for technical transfer, in which case you would do the technically demanding thing first, then immediately do the classic exercise.
That's something that we've talked about. I think I've got some videos on this where we categorize complexes as either like a technique exercise, where we'll do one variation followed by the competition lift to get that carryover of the constraint that you're experiencing with that variation. I think that's probably one of my favorite tools, because early on I would just like try and hammer that variation because I found something that worked, and I would just hammer it, and then I wouldn't see much carryover to the full lift, and started doing those complexes, and that really helped. And then the other thing that you said, I always called them like quality complexes. Like what qualities were you trying to develop? Maybe like a 2 clean, 3 cleans plus 1 jerk. Maybe that's ability to make jerks under heavy leg fatigue, or something like that. Those are also a fantastic tool for athletes.
Yeah, exactly. And you basically just look at that like, everything has to have a logical reason for being done. And the more you're able to do that as a coach, the better you're going to get. Because then you start to realize like, man, I just make a lot of dumb choices. I make a lot of choices because they seem good and I can kind of pass them off as being smart. But ultimately it's like, yeah, this isn't really helping. It just feels good.
Yeah, kind of to what you guys were saying just a little earlier too. Like I'll have a lot of young kids like ask me, hey, what's wrong with this lift? And I'm like, oh, you need to stay over the bar for longer, whatever technique error it might be. And they'll be like, okay, so how do I do that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, they're like, what do I do? Like hang snatch? And I'm like, well,
yeah. What exercise do I do?
You're trying to just like hammer an exercise onto it without like, I'm like, no, you just do that cue I told you, or whatever it might be. Like you have to like apply that at lighter weights, or it's like there's kind of a disconnect there. What do you think like the most common technique errors that you're seeing among like American lifters are?
I would say in the snatch and clean, it's going to be like for beginners, it's almost always that they just catch the bar really high. They don't have a lot of confidence going under the bar. And then as a result of that, you probably also see a lot of athletes that rush the pull. They overextend, or they extend too early. They get behind the bar in the middle of the pull. And then like that's probably the most common. And then like in the jerk, I think it's just really not having good footwork, or like really poor timing just in general between the feet and the hands. And a lot of that is just like it's more fundamental, like just practicing the exercise early on, a lot of times, a lot of reps, and like really like drilling it as a skill versus just like doing workouts with jerks.
Absolutely. So I'm curious to know, who are your favorite technicians in the sport of weightlifting? Like if you had to go through a top 3 technicians, what are some ones that come to mind here?
It's a good question. Like, who are the best technicians? Like, there's like what I would describe as technique that's aesthetically pleasing, and then there's technique that's really efficient. And if you look at the most efficient technicians, they don't look super pretty, in my opinion, right? Like, or they might, you might have an athlete that has like a unique body style, like a Lu Xiaojun. I wouldn't say his technique is like He's excellent technician, obviously, but it's like he doesn't have technique that's going to be something that a long-limbed, girl who lives in Florida who's 16 is going to replicate. Like, she's probably not going to be doing pretty-looking squat jerks, right? But like, just like objectively, I would say there's so many good examples. I would say probably the most traditional, really exceptional technician that probably isn't known by a lot of people was Alexei Petrov, the Russian guy from the 90s. He looked like just like textbook. Like if you're like, this is a snatch or a clean and jerk, like this is what it's supposed to look like. He just moved super, super well. And there's just been so many athletes like that. Like today, a lot of the Russians had really like robotic looking technique because they trained with a system that developed it like that. But there was a Russian guy, Artem Akolov, back in like 2015, 2016. He really moved well, in the clean and jerk. Today, like, Lash's technique's pretty good. He's also just like so strong and so, talented that I mean, he moves really well for a super. I don't think I would put Gore up there as a like aesthetic technician. Yeah, and then on the women's side, I mean, like there's a lot of great technicians there. Basically, any of the medalists, a lot of the medalists from like, 71 down are pretty incredible. There's some really good. The Chinese girl who's super solid, Pei Jingyi, really really good technician. Yeah, just like a ton of them. Like there's a lot of people that are great technicians that move really well in one lift or maybe on two parts, but not in the jerk or something. And then you have people that just win, that are just like they look a little unorthodox. Carlos's technique is not what I would describe as like, particularly like that's how you would teach it. But I mean, he's a stud, right?
And you know what's interesting about him? Like I think it's kind of popular. Maybe the conversation's gone on for too long about Carlos's technique, where
Yeah.
people will say that he like doesn't have efficient technique or doesn't have good technique or textbook technique. But even at his level, it's gotten better.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. His snatch technique has improved dramatically, and he moves really well for the way he moves. Like he doesn't actually get super far forward. He doesn't jump forward super bad anymore. Like he's pretty phenomenal.
He's still on the up and up. I'm interested to see what he does over the if he can stay healthy and
Yeah.
not have anything happen. Uh, I think that we're going to see some pretty crazy lifts out of him. What if you had to guess? What would you expect the future to look like for Carlos?
He told us that he'd said that he'd done like 189, 237 in training in 2022. So like I would imagine if he can do an all-time best at 94 and he'd have to exceed, I mean, Kashvili's did 235 at 90, which I don't think Carlos has that. He hasn't done that. It was 89 when he did 225. So like, if Carlos could do 236 at 90, that would be the best ever clean and jerk by, most ever over body weight clean and jerk, I believe. And so like I could see something like that, like some clean and jerk that's outrageous. As a 94, could he do 237, 240? If he had like, maybe if it was a special kind of meet where, WADA didn't show up and it was like they forgot to get on the flight or something. And, I would be all about that. I'd love to see Carlos do, 192 and 193 and 240.
Maybe they'll host a world championships in Russia or North Korea or something, and we won't have any drug testing. But probably not looking like that anytime soon. I do remember hearing stories. I don't know if this is true, but like I remember hearing stories that they would do drug testing in Russia, and the drug testers would just like never come back.
I heard different stories. I heard stories that Russians had that North Korea, they just wouldn't let them in. They couldn't get visas, so they wouldn't even let them in. It was like, well, it's not our fault, which is like, oh, of course. And then like, people falsifying arrest records, like their friends were a cop and the drug testers would show up and they'd run away and then they'd be like, where was he? Be like, oh, well, he was in jail last night. It's like, what? He's been arrested like 26 times this year. So yeah, I mean, who knows? There's all kinds of stuff like that.
Why don't we wrap this up with probably your 3 favorite lifts of all time? So I want to see like, what are the incredible moments that come to mind? The 246 Ilya Ilin clean and jerk, the Naeem 190,
I mean, I wouldn't even say the top 3 is just too hard. I have to think about that for a long time. But I would say like some lifts that I would think were just like super memorable would be when, like a good example, like 2017 Worlds, Mart Seam comes out for a 253 clean and jerk, and like the whole Iranian crowd is just like booing him so hard, and it was just brutal. But then the entire like everyone else in the stadium just started getting on their feet and cheering for him, and he made it, and it was just like this huge like fu to the fans that were just like super distasteful. And that was awesome, and because you kind of like, you felt like, yeah, that was us, like we lifted a few of those kilos. Lasha's 220 was that same meet, the first time he did 220, because it was like, this is like otherworldly, like no one's even done anything like this.
I mean, it'd been like 30 something years since Abadjiev's 216.
And Salimi was kind of like a one-off, just kind of out of nowhere, barely broke it by a kilo, and you're like, man, this guy's amazing, but he's like, it didn't seem like he had this like massive staying power. And then, I would say like Gore trying 220 at the Olympics, because he was close. I mean, he was legitimately, he had that lift. Had he like just a tiny bit more, he would have made it. He was on his way up. And then like I remember the 2008 Olympics. We watched Andrei Romnau. Me, Martine, and Donnie Schenkel watched it on TV, and I never in my life saw 2 people give up because of someone else's success. It was insane. It was like he was so dominant. It was unreal. He just like murdered everybody, 6 for 6, 200 snatch, 236 clean jerk, and it just looked like effortless. And both of them were just like, well, we'll never beat that. We're done. Like it just took the sail out of everybody's, the wind out of everyone's sails.
I don't think Donnie's had light in his eyes since then.
No, yeah, no. There's not a lot going on behind those eyes, but yeah, I mean, like those kind of lifts. There's just so many of them. There's so many of those like events. Like a lot of too, like is big lifts. I mean, probably one I'll leave you guys with would be probably the dumbest lift I've seen, and I say that in frustration, but not at them, but in frustration at the situation, but like kind of at them was Rockmat's clean and jerk in Thailand, like that you're never gonna forget how stupid you were to go out there without even resting, and like maybe he would have missed it, whatever, maybe any of those things could have happened, but it's like, man, what a dumb mistake. Like what, like you didn't just do what you normally do, like you just ran up and missed it, and it was like, man, that was so frustrating, and I felt so bad for him, and he's such a nice guy, and like, but it's like, yeah, that one was probably brutal.
The Rotmat and I have so many of the young high school kids, which I don't think have ever watched like international weightlifting ever, but the young weightlifters, especially in Florida, they love talking about those two.
Yeah.
It seems like those are the heroes for them, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's cool to see how Weightlifting House has like really done that and like brought that to the kind of the forefront of the conversation. So it's kind of cool, and it's also cool to just see you and Seb doing commentary at these big national or big international meets. I don't know if I ever told you this. So I met Seb for the first time at the first at the first like Penlay training camp.
Wow.
Back in the day. And so this was like right after he'd started Weightlifting House. He had like 5 YouTube videos up, and they were like vlog videos,
Yeah.
And so that was like that week is when he started Weightlifting House with Penlay and was doing the podcast regularly.
Oh, wow.
So it's kind of crazy to see how that has developed over time.
Him and Josh talk about that a lot. They've always talked about that, those kind of being super important to them, the camp.
It was easily one of the pivotal turning points in my life for sure was that training camp. So it's kind of cool.
Nice. I got a question. Do you think that Weightlifting House will be able to do commentary at the Olympics in 2028?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not for. I mean, Seb could. I don't know what he's up to, but like, I think it's just like it's so ridiculous. Like NBC doing all this. You know, they'll just pick. I mean, it's possible, but like they'll just pick people, right? And it's like it seems like you have to like have an in and a no, and it's like there's probably people that are like on a list that they're the ones that get picked now because they've been on this list for 15 years or something, right? It's maybe not no, but like I think it's unlikely because I think it's going to come down to like being in the right place and getting a deal done and having whatever. Seb's the guy to do that though, so it's possible.
If anybody could do it, it would be Seb. But right now, it seems like all it would take is just standing in the right spot because it seems like they just get random people.
It's random to us, but it's like some of these people are just like commentators, professional commentators, right? So like they do other sports and like to the Olympics, it's like they don't care. They just pick somebody and put them in, right?
Yeah. NBC, if you're listening, hook up our boy Seb. Let him do the thing he does best.
He'd be great at it. He'd be perfect in it.
NBC listened an hour 40 into our podcast.
Yeah, they probably did.
All right, guys, we'll go ahead and wrap it there. Calvin, where can people find you?
On everywhere at Calvin Lackey, 81 kg.
And what about you, Max?
Yeah, you can find me same, pretty much Instagram, my YouTube channel, Coach Max Ada, and then anywhere else.
And you guys can find me at Big Ben Strength. We'll catch you guys next week. Bye.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to check out this video here or this episode of the Last Set Best Set podcast.